Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining me once again, and welcome back to Dominions 5. We're not playing a game today. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion. This is a discussion born out of a conversation that I was having a little while ago with Eric Tams, who has been one of my best Patreon supporters for a long time. Thank you very much for your support of the channel, Eric. And he was asking me about blesses. Specifically, we were talking about some of the more unusual blesses and why they're more unusual and how you might be able to use them effectively. Because there are, we have this great complicated bless system in Dominions 5 now, unlike Dominions 3 and 4, etc., where you can build your own kind of custom blessing. But a lot of those blessings are of minimal use, or at least situational, whereas some of them are just always useful. And so, it would be very he thought it would be interesting to have a video where we talk about the blessings and what's good, what's bad, and how you might use the situational ones. So this is actually going to be part 1 of 2. In this part, we're going to have a sort of general discussion of what blesses are quote-unquote good, or at least generally useful, and why. In part 2, I'm going to be playing around with this a little bit more, and in part 2 later this month, I'm going to talk about how you might use some of the more situational blesses and what nations and units might potentially make use of certain blessings that are a little more unusual. So right now, I just picked Early Age Machaka because I played them before. And I've just lined up 3 points in every lore, in every path, so that we can look at all of the blessing effects. Now the first thing you notice, of course, is the distinction between incarnate and non-incarnate blesses. Every bless that's below 4 points is non-incarnate, and so is active as long as your god is alive, even if they haven't woken up. And that's the biggest and most obvious distinction. Every path has between 3 and 5 incarnate-only blesses, which cost more than 4 points. And those blesses are more powerful than the lesser ones, generally speaking, but they also, of course, require a lot more commitment, and they only activate when your god is awake, which puts a real limiter on how many points your god can have, effectively, since if you have incarnate blesses, you don't really want a dormant, and you really don't want an imprisoned god. So you're looking at primarily awake gods, which of course have a lot fewer points to spend. Potentially dormant if you're going for some kind of turn 12 timing attack kind of thing. That can definitely work if you don't need the blessing for expansion, but that will kind of depend on exactly how strong your sacred units are. In general, and I would say this is a general rule with lots of loopholes and exceptions, and it's not 100% accurate, and of course it's only my opinion, but in general, I would say you get more bang for your buck taking multiple minor blesses than you do taking incarnate blesses. Incarnate blesses tend to not be as strong for the money, in my opinion, as the lesser blesses do. And a lot of this is because not only do they require you to be awake, so that they give you fewer points to play with, paths require more and more points in a non-linear way. Going from 6 to 7, sort of flaming weapons to awe, costs a lot more points than going from 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, or etc. So getting the highest level of bless, awe, thunder weapons, quickness, fortitude, etc., all of those are extremely expensive. Some of them are actually incredibly expensive, so expensive that I don't think there's a reasonable use case for them. For example, ethereality. Ethereality is actually a really powerful quality to have. It just straight up negates, or mostly negates, any non-magical attack, which is a lot of attacks. I mean, it makes your sacred troops highly resistant to normal troops attacking them, but it not only is incarnate, it not only requires 10 astral bless points, and getting to astral 10 is expensive, really expensive for any god ever. It also requires magic 3, so you can't even really dump scales to take it. So you're spending, if we were to look at, say, who's got a good astral score? Let's look at the Netter of the Moon, who has astral 3. Going to astral 10 with the Netter of the Moon, you've already used up almost all of your points. Then you also need magic 3. Now I need to lose a ton of points somewhere else. So like maybe we go down to neutral heat, or go up to heat 3. Something like this. We can go dormant, I guess, but if you go dormant, then you don't have the ethereality early on. So, it's very hard to afford ethereality. And then, or etherealness as they put it. And then, of course, etherealness is countered by casting a spell. which is also the thing that already counters sacred troops, typically speaking. So, you know, hitting them with magma eruption, or maws of the earth, or gifts from heaven, or falling fires, or any of the classic spells that cause damage, mind burn, or soul slay, whatever. All of those spells ignore etherealness because they all do magical damage. Since magical damage is already the counter to tough troops, which sacreds tend to be, making your troops really, really tough, but not against magic, honestly isn't that big a change. It doesn't fundamentally change what the opponent has to do to stop you, if that makes sense. It merely means that they have to commit a little bit more to the bit, which they're already probably willing to do. So, in any case, so that's an explanation or a reason for why Incarnate Blesses sometimes aren't very good, aren't nearly as good as you would think they are, just because the commitment is too high. Minor Blesses tend to be just kind of basic stat increase things. Elemental resistances, survivals, morale, attack skill, increases to stats. Swiftness, more shock, different resistances, survivals, water walking, reinvigoration. There are a couple of exceptions, like Reconstruction and Spirit Sight are interesting little changes. You have the Weapon Blesses, which tend to be incarnate, but not all of them. So, like, Frost Weapons is non-incarnate. Solar Weapons is non-incarnate and terrible. But some of them are very expensive, for example. Death Weapons. Death Weapons are very expensive. Unholy Weapons are quite expensive, albeit not as expensive. But so the first main distinction when you're choosing a bless is incarnate versus non-incarnate, major versus minor. Some of the major blesses are actually really good and high value, generally speaking, and some of them are not. So let's talk about the things that make, and this discussion will kind of have to be tied in with what makes a good sacred unit, a strong sacred unit, because the different qualities of your sacred units kind of affect what blesses you want for them. So, for example, if you are Ashdod, which is probably one of the archetypical bless Russian nations, Ashdod has sacreds that, while very expensive, have more attack density than you would expect because they have 2 attacks each, have a lot of HP, a lot of stats in general, and hit like trucks because of their high strength, and have built-in magical weapons. So right off the bat, Anakites, the Ashdod Sacred, has a bunch of qualities that make them already a very powerful unit. You can then use blesses, stack blesses on top of that to push them to the point where normal troops would really, really struggle to counter them in any meaningful way. The qualities that make a strong sacred unit of that type, an expensive, elite, superpowered sacred. High HP is definitely one, high strength is another. High attack skill and protection are kind of secondary, but if you have a lot of HP and a lot of strength, you're halfway to being pretty solid. You do need some kind of defensive stat, so high protection, high defense, ideally both. Anakites happen to have both. Or, well, they have okay protection and high defense scores. So you need something to keep you alive, and you need something to help you kill people. If you have high HP and high strength, by virtue of being a giant, basically, so if you are a giant sacred, then Regeneration is incredibly good value for you. The Regeneration only costs 7 Nature Bless points. It gives you 10% of your HP back every turn. You can combine Regeneration with Blood Bond, since you're already awake, so Regeneration and Blood Bond, that means the damage is spread out. More units will be regenerating every turn, meaning there's more total damage being cancelled out and recovered. It's an incredibly strong combination, and it's one that's honestly not super expensive. Regeneration only costs 7 Nature Bless points, Blood Bond only costs 5 blood, and 7 B5 is not hard to get. It's not super expensive. You'll have the room to buy some scales along with that, even if you took an Awake God of some kind. And that's a very budget, effectively, major bless that can make giant sacreds incredibly efficient. But there are different kinds of sacreds that don't necessarily benefit from that. Like, for example, if your sacreds have human HP, then regeneration is kind of a waste, because they'll only be regenerating 1 hit point per round. Or if your sacreds are very offensive, if they have low defensive stats but very high offensive stats, then regeneration is also kind of a waste because they're not going to live long anyway. They're going to be killed if they have low armor, if they have low defense score, if they dual wield weapons, don't have a shield or something. There are lots of things that will just lead to them dying. And as a result, the Regeneration won't give them a whole lot of value because they won't be around to use it for many, many, many rounds of combat, which is what makes Regeneration really valuable. You know, Regeneration is only good if you can stay in the fight for 10 rounds, regenerating 3 or 4 HP a round. You know, then effectively you've increased your HP by 40. Whereas if you're in combat for 2 rounds and die, you've increased your HP effectively by 8, which is not super impressive. So, you know, you have some really value Incarnate Blesses, but a lot of the Incarnate Blesses, I would say, are overpriced. And I guess it's worthwhile here to talk about the distinction between something that is overpriced or situational and something that is so overpriced as to be actually a bad decision. There are some blesses on this list where I don't see a use case for them, where they're just too expensive to be worthwhile. The main culprits, the 2 main culprits here are Etherealness, which we've talked about, and Fear. Fear costs 10 Death Bless points, which is very, very expensive no matter who's taking it. It's also incarnate, so you have to be awake for it. And it lowers enemy morale, which is great, but Fear, from Dominions 4, Fear was changed to cap at a total penalty of -5, which isn't enough to reliably, successfully drive a squad off the battlefield, at least not in short order. And if you're paying for a Fear Bless, you're very unlikely to be able to afford pretty much anything else as a Bless. So you'll have Fear, but your very scary Sacreds won't actually have other stat Blesses to help them leverage that Fear into something. So Fear and Etherealness are, in my opinion, 2 Blesses where I don't think there is a good use case for them in the game as it stands. I don't think there is a faction out there that really wants to take either Fear or Etherealness in any circumstance, in any matchup, really under any circumstances, unless maybe it's in like a 2-person duel game where you're planning to rush incredibly quickly to try and end the game in the first like 15 turns with Ethereal Sacreds or something. I don't know. Even then, Fear I don't think is valuable, but Etherealness maybe if you're playing like Middle-Aged Marignon or something. I don't know. Fortitude is more justifiable. Fortitude and Regeneration, and Blood Bond. All 3 of those are, in my opinion, quite good. Fortitude is more expensive now, but there are still some factions that can do it pretty cheaply, notably Agartha. And half damage from all physical attack types is actually really good. In particular, Fortitude can be combined with Regeneration and or Blood Bond, depending on how many points you have to play with, to make giant Sacreds that are pretty much invincible to non-magical attacks. And even, or rather, let me rephrase that are very difficult to kill with damage, generally speaking. If you have Fortitude, Regeneration, Blood Bonded giants, you're probably going to have to kill them with something that bypasses the normal damage mechanics, like Soul Slay, or Charm spells, or what have you. You know, something that doesn't allow them to tank through the damage. At the very least, you'll need to use untyped damage, which is quite rare. Not many attacks in the game aren't either Pierce, Slash, or Blunt. Cave Crab Claw attacks are untyped, which is actually one odd advantage of them, albeit I still wouldn't use them now because they've been nerfed. They're twice as expensive as they should be, as they were before. Beyond that, what else is untyped damage? Untyped elemental damage will work. So, like, Falling Fires won't be affected by Fortitude. Incinerate, Frozen Heart, those spells won't be affected by Fortitude, which is great. So those spells can work wonders in this kind of situation. But still, Fortitude gives you a lot of survivability, especially in the early game, so that's a pretty solid choice. And it lets you munch through chaff very effectively without taking a whole lot of damage if you have Fortitude and Regeneration, or Regeneration and Blood Bond, or etc. I wouldn't take Fortitude and Blood Bond, I would rather take Fortitude and Regen, just so that you can actually get some of that HP back. But as Blood Bond without Regeneration just kind of spreads the damage out and leads to all of your Sacreds racking up tons and tons of afflictions. Other really generally useful incarnate high-level blesses. The only one that really comes to mind is, well, the only ones that really come to mind, Thunder Weapons. Thunder Weapons are very powerful. They're one of the situational ones because not a lot of factions have the ability to take high-level air at a reasonable price. But for those nations, I'm specifically thinking of Nazca here, Thunder Weapons can be quite powerful. It's the only, I would say, really, really useful weapon bless in most situations. And then, of course, you have fire and shock resistance, which is pretty much useful for everyone all the time. Fire and shock damage are both very common magically, and very dangerous. Shock damage in particular is incredibly dangerous. And so, getting 10 fire resistance and 10 shock resistance is a pretty good deal. In particular, you can then also combo it if you also take air with one of the other shock resistance blesses to give yourself a total shock resistance of like 20 before casting any spells. That's enough for a normal human unit, to probably survive a direct hit from a Thunder Strike. Albeit not guaranteed, and you would still almost certainly be stunned to hell. But still, you wouldn't necessarily be actually dead. So, there's a series of the expensive Incarnate Blesses. There are some that are probably good ideas depending on, what qualities your Sacreds have. If your Sacreds are fast with multiple attacks, Thunder Weapons is very good value. If your Sacreds are giants who could use being really, really tanky, then some combination of Regeneration, Blood Bond, and Fortitude could be a very good idea, because it just doubles down on the strengths they already have. And this, I would say, is probably the general theme with Blesses. You don't necessarily use Blesses to shore up weaknesses, except for Elemental Resistance Blesses. You use Blesses primarily to magnify strengths, to take places where your troops are already unusually good, where your Sacreds are already skilled, and then make those so strong that the enemy will have a tough time stopping them, because they will have to contend with the immense strengths of these Sacreds in order to do so. So, in order to deal with your Anakites, which have Fortitude, Blood Bond, and Regeneration, they first have to get through the fact that those Anakites are almost impossible for most units to kill, because they take half damage, and subtracted by their pretty significant protection. That's a small fraction of their HP. It then gets doled out to everyone around them to spread the damage further, and then they all regenerate all that HP back at the end of the round. It just makes, probably half or more of the units in the game cannot feasibly kill a group of Anakites with that bless, no matter what. It's just unlikely to happen unless they've deployed specific counters. And that's really, of course, the goal in all Dominions combat, is to put your opponent in a position where they have to read your mind and deploy specific counters to the things that you're deploying, which gives you the initiative, the advantage, the ability to dictate the pace and events of the war, because you're the one pushing in and they're the ones trying to react to you. There are a bunch of larger Incarnate Blesses as well that are a lot more situational. For example, Barkskin. Barkskin is actually a very situational bless, because it does give you fire vulnerability. Also, it's 10 natural protection, so units that already have significant natural protection, or that wear very heavy armor, don't really benefit much from it. If you give Barkskin to Blind Fighters, Late Age Agarthan Blind Fighter Sacreds, it barely moves the needle on their prot. It increases their prot by, I think, 2, maybe 1, because they already have very, very heavy armor. If you give this to Knights of the Chalice from Middle Age Marignon, same thing. They already wear heavy armor. Barkskin maybe pushes their prot up by 3, if I recall correctly. But even so, it's not a lot, and it includes that fire vulnerability, which in those cases is actually worth more is actually a bigger penalty than the total bonus that you get from Barkskin. So Barkskin is an example of a bless that is useful primarily on lower HP and or lower prot Sacreds, where either a small increase in prot is really valuable, or Barkskin provides a larger increase in prot. The archetypical Sacred that benefits from a Barkskin bless is probably the Vanheir. Vanheirs are the blesses of Early Age Vanheim, and they are very, very good. I've lost Vanheim. Where has it gone? Come here, you. Come on, elves. Get over here. There it is. Vanheim. So, not Einheirs. Oh, Lord, I have a mod on. Okay, ignore that. I figured out I made a mistake. Anyway, here's Vanheir's. Vanhirs, as you can see, they have moderate protection, but not super high. They don't have any natural protection, so Barkskin would work perfectly well on them. They're expensive, but they have basically human level, hit points. However, they have a lot of strength and attack skill, and they have high attack density, plus they have Berserker +5 inherently. And Berserk adds to natural protection, and it stacks with Barkskin. So for Vanhirs, Barkskin is an incredibly good pickup, because what it means is, once they go Berserk, they'll end up with natural protection 15, which stacks with their armor value of 13 to give them a total prot of significantly over 20. These guys with prot over 20, and with the Berserker +5, meaning they're hitting at strength 18 with attack skill 18, will mulch through the enemy very, very quickly while taking very minimal damage. The Barkskin plus their glamour, plus their, their defense skill once they go Berserk is almost nothing. But the Barkskin will help keep them alive even as they are being attacked, and their Berserker will help their 2 high-quality attacks, very high-quality attacks, cleave through the enemy very, very quickly. So that's definitely a one Sacred that might prefer Barkskin over, say, Regeneration, or another high-level Nature Bless. Some of the other high-level blesses that are more situational. Awe. Awe is an excellent example of a very situational bless. Awe is a great defensive ability, because it just makes the enemy take a ton of checks in order to successfully attack you. However, the check is not that hard if the enemy knows it's coming and prepares for it, because it's just a morale check. If you buff up your troops' morale significantly by either using a very good leader, or casting Sermon of Courage, or Fanaticism, the battlefield version, or if you just use really high morale troops in general, and Sacreds tend to be really high morale troops, then Awe isn't such a big deal. The place where Awe comes into its own is when your troops are facing off against 2 or 3 militia each, or light infantry, or whatever else has a morale score of 10 or 11, and half of those guys just outright fail the check to attack them, and so do nothing. That's the situation in which Awe is actually a powerful bless. In order to use Awe, what you'll want then is a Sacred that's already defensively pretty tough, because the Awe will then stack with high defense score or high prot, or a good repel ability or what have you, to increase the number of times that while under attack that Sacred takes no damage. And taking no damage is of course the goal. So I wouldn't say that you want Awe on Giants particularly, just because Giants already have, blesses that they like better, Regeneration, Fortitude, and Blood Bond. But Awe might be something that you could consider on, I'm specifically thinking of Sacreds that can repel, which means Sacreds that have long weapons. So for example, if we're looking at, Middle-Aged Machaka, we've talked about these guys. Middle-Aged Machaka has a length 4 spear with a weapon on their Black Hunter. So if they have Awe plus the repelling ability of the spear, that could be actually quite effective, especially if you also boost attack skill to give more repellability. That Black Hunter, a Black Hunter with Awe and plus attack bless, although it would be very hard to do both Awe and plus attack because they're both fire blesses. But a Black Hunter with Awe could potentially be able to repel a significant number of attacks, tank a certain number of attacks with his high protection and decent defense skill, and then of course his hit points are fairly low, so once one sneaks through he will die. But still, he might be able to last for a while by doing that. In terms of other Sacreds for whom Awe might be a good idea, probably not Skin Shifters. But potentially Maidens of the Moon. Since Maidens of the Moon have Formation Fighter and they have length 3 spears, attacks will tend to be divvied up pretty widely against them. Like, they have, 3 of them in a square. So, if you're only taking 1 or 2 attacks a round, then Awe has a decent chance of completely negating whatever damage you would have taken by forcing the enemy to cancel their attacks. The other one that might use Awe could be perhaps Arcos of Folly with the Heart Companions. Now, Heart Companions aren't great Sacreds in general, but I mean, if you wanted high fire for whatever reason, you might do worse than getting an Awe Bless and using that repel plus prop plus defense skill combo to achieve a little bit. Now, I will say that Awe currently is overpriced for what it does for you, but it's still, It's still not bad. I keep clicking on the wrong buttons because I'm dumb, I guess. It's not the worst. You have definitely worse. Thunder weapons, of course, all you need for thunder weapons to be good is a sacred with multiple attacks. That's literally it. Thunder weapons really scales dramatically off the number of attacks your sacreds have and off their attack density. So any sacred with 2 or 3 attacks, thunder weapons is definitely worth considering. So nations that might want thunder weapons, for example, Baratos, or any other nation that can summon Seir, potentially. Although those nations typically want other blesses for the Seer, like that Regeneration Blood Bond combo or something like that. Potentially Is. Morvarks on land have 3 attacks, if I recall correctly. And thunder weapons would apply to all of them except... I guess it would not apply to the Morvark horse's Fire Breath. But it would apply to the hoof attack, it would apply to the spear attack. Yeah. Thunder weapons on Morvarks could be a decent ask, a decent buy, if you want high air on your god for whatever reason. Fate Weaving. Fate Weaving and Luck are very interesting ones. Luck, like Etherealness, I think is too expensive. 9 Astral is still very expensive, and then a Luck scale of 2 or more. That's pretty pricey overall. And Luck is a lot more limited than most of the other unit buffs that you'll want to be dropping down. I mean, like casting Will of the Fates or something to... or trying to give as many people as possible Luck is still a good idea. I just don't know that I would pay like 300 design points for it. Fate Weaving, however, is actually a very good bless. Fate Weaving curses the people who attack you so that they get lower DRNs, lower random rolls attached to their stats, and by a significant margin. So that makes enemy units a lot easier to kill, and also, if I recall correctly, a lot easier to block, to survive against, than it would if they weren't fate woven. But, of course, Fate Weaving requires that your Sacreds survive an attack attempt first. So once again, for Fate Weaving, you kind of want a tanky Sacred, and whether that's a Sacred that has a high defense score, a Sacred that has high prot, or a Sacred that has high HP, or preferably all 3, all of them can benefit. Fate Weaving is another one that's decent on Giants, it's one that's great on Elves, it's good on... In fact, Fate Weaving is good on a lot of different Sacreds, just because it really does penalize people for killing you. And penalizing the enemy for killing you is, of course, an excellent choice, generally speaking. We've talked about Fire and Shock Resistance. Fire and Shock Resistance fits in a ton of builds because it's very basic, it's very useful, it counteracts the primary method by which, or one of the primary methods by which expensive troops like Sacreds die easily. Like, you know, casting Incinerate on a guy who has 5 or 10 fire resistance built in is a lot less efficient than casting Incinerate on a guy who took Fortitude. Because Fortitude does nothing about Incinerate, and fire resistance does. Hard Skin is a more situational one. Now, Hard Skin can definitely work, but Hard Skin is more or less the opposite of Bark Skin. For Bark Skin, you want Sacreds that have low natural protection. For Hard Skin, you would like Sacreds that already have high natural protection, and that's because, unlike Bark Skin, Hard Skin is a straight addition. So Bark Skin works just like the Bark Skin spell, which means that it pushes you up to, from whatever you are, it pushes you either up to 10 natural protection, or if you're already over 10, it just adds 1, and then it makes you weak to fire. Hard Skin just straight up adds 5. Whatever your natural protection is, Hard Skin makes it 5 higher, and it doesn't have an elemental weakness attached. So, on certain nations, Hard Skin could be fairly useful. I am thinking specifically of Middle Age Agartha here. Hard Skin Middle Age Agarthan sacred statues are very difficult to kill. Now, usually, if you end up with Hard Skin on Middle Age Agartha, you're forced to cut back on something else that might also help your statues. Like, you probably won't be able to take Reconstruction, for example. So your sacred statues will have to return to a lab you own in order to heal. But still, Hard Skin, maybe not a bad choice. That's definitely one that I could see myself doing. Chill Aura, the Aura Blesses in general, Chill Aura and Heat Aura, are actually both quite effective. They have built-in elemental resists. They spread these auras that cause a lot of fatigue and also secondary negative effects. The Chill Aura freezes people. The Heat Aura lights people on fire. Both of those are very good effects. They're a little bit pricey, but generally I would say you can make them worth it. For this, what you want is Sacreds who are... This is another tanky Sacred's Bless. And okay, so a lot of the Incarnate Blesses seem geared towards Sacreds that are basically tanky. Fortitude, Hardskin, Fire and Shock Resistance, Fate Weaving, Regeneration, Blood Bond, all of these blesses, you know, Heat Aura, Fire Shield, Awe, all of those blesses are basically blesses geared towards increasing defensive ability, and they work best on a Sacred that already has high defensive capabilities. The non-incarnate blesses are much more geared, in my opinion, a lot more of them are geared towards killing Sacreds, towards Sacreds who hit hard and inflict a lot of damage. The most obvious of them, of course, are attack skill and bonus strength, strength of the flesh and strength of the earth. All three of those are designed specifically and explicitly to increase the killing power of your Sacreds, and they do so in a very straightforward way. They make them hit more often and they make them hit harder. That's it. They're all three of them very solid. They cost 3 points for +2 of whatever. Attack, slash strength, slash also defense. You can't get defense skill, but I would say it's generally a little bit less useful. So all of those just straight up increase your killing power. All of those are very solid in most circumstances. There's, like, the vast majority of Sacreds will benefit from and like plus attack skill or plus strength. There's no reason they wouldn't, except of course the price. Elemental resistances, great little utility choices, also very, very commonly useful. But there are a bunch of these lesser blesses also that are much more uncommonly useful. Useful only in specific situations. Specific ones I'm thinking of here. Reconstruction, obviously. Very, very specialized. Only works if you have statues who are Sacreds, which I think only Middle Age Agartha does. So I think in most other cases this is irrelevant. Magic resistance, however, is a very good one. Magic resistance basically directly counters one of the most dangerous things the enemy can do to your expensive, valuable Sacreds, which is cast Soul Slay or Charm spells or what have you on them to make them die or make them change sides. Having some magic resistance stacked up really, really helps avoid that. If at all possible, this should be comboed with a casting of anti-magic for an extra +4. In any situation where you really expect to need it. But just having +2 or +3 magic resistance hanging around is an excellent idea. Spirit Sight, once again, situational but very, very useful in that situation. If you're going to be fighting a lot in caves and you know it, or you're going to be fighting invisible units and you know it, then Spirit Sight can be really cool. Now, how often does that happen? Not terribly often. But if you're playing in a game with a lot of high-level death nations, and you're worried that they're going to cast Darkness, then Spirit Sight might potentially be useful, because with Spirit Sight, your units ignore darkness penalties. So normally if you're fighting in darkness against an enemy who usually likes darkness, the total stat swing is like 5 or 6 points of everything. Like, you lose 3, they, or more, they don't lose anything. Effectively, they're much, much more powerful than you are now, and they're going to beat you up. If you have Spirit Sight, that doesn't happen. So depending on the map, depending on your opponents, it might be a decent meta choice. In a black box, white room scenario, probably wouldn't take it. It just depends on who you know you're playing and how you know they play. Water walking is another interesting one, and this I would say is definitely on the low end of situational. I'm not sure there are a lot of situations where water walking is actually a good idea. The only situation I can think of where I would be happy to have a water walking bless is if, of course, I've taken Heat 3 Dominion, so I'm not normally going to be able to cross rivers. And I know I'm on a map with a lot of rivers right around me. If I'm in that situation, then spending the relatively cheap cost to take water walking might be a good idea. But in most other situations, in a standard map, rivers are not going to be that much of an obstacle. Not enough of an obstacle, but you have to dedicate points at Pretender God generation to them. Precision, Farshot, and Swiftness. All three of these have uses. They're all kind of in that situational category, I would say. Shock Resistance is not. Shock Resistance is just straight up good. Especially if you're fighting a bird nation, or if just there are a lot of air nations in the game. Let's say you're playing in the Middle Age, and your opponents are like Pythium, Phlegra, Phacia, Calum, and Nazca. All of those nations have easy access to a lot of high shock damage spells and summoning air elementals, all kinds of stuff. So in that game, taking shock resistance as a bless might be a good idea. Might be a really good idea, actually. But all three of these, that just increases precision. Honestly, I would say this is more of a mage bless than anything. Nobody has really good sacred archers, or massable sacred archers, really. But higher precision on long-range spells can make a difference. Far shot, once again, nobody has good sacred archers, so this isn't really relevant. Swiftness is an interesting one because it gives you plus defense skill, so it's like half of, well, the defense skill bless, plus a bunch of movement rate, and an increased, unspecified but increased chance to strike first in combat. If you have Sacred Cavalry, then Swiftness can be very, very amusing, because Sacred Cavalry already moves pretty fast. Add Swiftness on top of that, and you're now looking at, to quote Dark Helmet, ludicrous speed. And on top of that, they get a little bit more defense, and Cavalry tends to already have pretty high defense. So that extra point from Swiftness is worth more than an extra point in most other circumstances would be. But once again, situational. You don't really need this or want this unless you already have kind of fast sacreds, and you expect the kind of, and you're anticipating the kind of enemy armies that can be actually taken apart by relatively small numbers of elite cavalry rushing around behind them before they can react. Those armies do exist, especially in the early game. They're not super reliable once you've advanced a little further, so take that for what it's worth. The survivals, generally speaking, I would say aren't worth it. They could be worth it if, once again, they could be worth it if you know exactly what the terrain is and where you want to go. I generally don't before the game starts, and absent knowing that, I'm not going to take a survival that might just not be relevant pretty much ever. So Swamp Survival is definitely one of those. Wasteland Survival, also definitely one of those. The one potential use case for Swamp Survival is Swamp Survival negates the disease effect of Satis's Dominion, middle-aged Satis's Dominion. So if you're playing in a game against middle-aged Satis, and you are a nation that has decent sacreds, you might consider getting Swamp Survival. Because Swamp Survival is one of the ones that's on even when the units are not blessed, and it makes them immune to that disease effect, which means they can actually invade Satisian territory without having to be written off as dead, diseased, riddled corpses. Mountain Survival, similar, but even less useful. Although, Mountain Survival does, if I recall correctly, allow you to travel through mountain paths which are closed due to cold. So that can be an interesting little surprise moment. I think that's how they work. That's how I remember them working a while back. I haven't tested that recently, so I don't actually know, I guess. I think they do. Last I knew, they let you move through cold mountain passes if you have Mountain Survival. So if you're using your sacred units very heavily, then you may be able to have some mobility in the winter that your opponent does not have, and that can be very useful. This video has actually gone on a little bit longer than I was hoping. In any case, in general, Incarnate Blesses, I think there are a lot of Incarnate Blesses that just aren't useful, like Reforming Flesh, that's only ever taken by Urmor, and even then only sometimes. Stygian Flesh, it's basically Bark Skin, but worse. Reanimators, it's shit. It doesn't work enough to matter. Recuperation is solid, but it's basically a poor man's regeneration when you're like, I don't need regeneration, but I do want to recover from afflictions, so recuperation will take that. Can also be used as part of a special strategy by people who are either summoning Tartarians or have valuable old mages. If you slap a shroud on them, a shroud of the Battle Saint, then they become sacred and blessed, and so they get the recuperation, and then they will heal up their afflictions from whatever reason. Actually, it won't work on old mages. Old mages specifically have recuperation disabled, but it will work on mages who have caught diseases or mages who have been injured in the field. So that can be a good idea if you have the pearls to spare and not mages to spare. Berserker is... Okay, Berserker is actually an interesting one. I'm going to talk about Berserker specifically in the second part of this little video series, because Berserker, in most cases, is a complete waste of time. In fact, can be actually dangerous to you. but Berserker for some specific nations using some specific strategies can be hilarious and powerful, but mostly hilarious. Twist Fate is decent utility. It just saves you from a hit. That's all it does. The weapon blesses also I'm going to talk about in detail later on. In general, and some of the weapon blesses are non-incarnate, some are incarnate. They cost different amounts. Frost weapons is non-incarnate but requires cold scales. Flaming weapons is incarnate and costs more. But I don't know. I'm not super impressed by any of the weapon blesses except for thunder weapons. Thunder weapons is very cool, but we'll talk about them and why they might be useful in the second part here. Fire Shield is another one, and Heat Aura, we'll talk about the auras. Death Explosion is one that I really want to be cool, but isn't, unfortunately. The big problem with it is that it doesn't include any fire resistance. So, yeah. It does fire damage when your sacreds die, and so it's only really usable on nations that have really, really cheap sacreds. But the problem is that really, really cheap sacreds also tend to be really fragile because they're just like shitty human militia level troops given the sacred tag. And so then they are shot with an arrow or something and explode, and that damages 2 other units and lowers their morale tremendously, and then someone else explodes, and then someone else, and everybody runs away. It's a suicide bless. It might be minimally useful comboed with, like, the ability to fly. I'm thinking particularly of middle-aged Mictlan taking some kind of weird Death Explosion bless combo for Eagle Warriors, who are just going to hop forward the first round of combat and land in the enemy back lines. That could potentially work, I guess, but it sounds very, very risky, and not like something I would want to try if my game or my life or whatever depended on it. And certainly I would not want to try just charging these guys forward to attack the enemy line. They will be destroyed before they make contact, often by chain reactions of the Death Explosions. So in any case, there's a lot of blessings here. It seems very complicated. In actual fact, what I've found is there's a fairly limited number of quote-unquote efficient or good or competitive bless choices. There's a lot more blesses that are vaguely silly, and there's a lot more blesses that could potentially be useful in specific situations. So I know I've been rambling a lot in this video, kind of trying to get my general point across and talking a lot about some of the higher level blesses. It's just been a long week. I'm just a little bit disorganized, to be honest. But the second part of this should be a little bit better organized, and will include some more specific discussion of the situations in which blesses that normally aren't taken could be taken and could be made to work. We'll talk about the weapon blesses, you know, poison, frost, fire, thunder weapons. We'll talk about the situations in which you might want Fate Weaving, Twist Fate, or Luck. There are, I think, situations where Luck can be justified. We'll talk about why magic weapons is valuable, and who might want to take magic weapons, and the answer is basically most people want to take magic weapons. It's just a question of whether they can afford it. And we'll talk about the overall utility of multiple low-level blesses versus 1 or 2 high-level blesses, why you choose one or the other, and under what circumstances you might want to make your sacreds huge. So, thanks for watching. Hopefully this has been at least somewhat useful and or interesting, and the second part of it here should, you know, coming out in a couple of weeks or what have you, should sort of tie things back together and make a little bit of sense of the whole bless system. So, thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.